our second discussion, which will guide us through FAIR in higher education. And here we have Kevin Ashley, Director at Digital Curation Center in BCC, who will be discussing with Alexander Refsum Jensenius. So Kevin is also the Vice Chair of the Digital Preservation Coalition, co-chair of the RDA Interest Group on Data Management Planning and National Data Services, and a member of the RDA Organizational Advisory Board. While Alexander comes from the music environment, he's a researcher, musician, working in the fields of embodied music recognition at the University of Oslo. So thank you very much. And Kevin, I'll let the floor to you.
Great. Thanks for that introduction, Sarah, and thanks, Alexander, for agreeing to join us today to talk about these issues. So we've just heard a little about some of the issues facing researchers, and obviously then tied up with that is the environment in which most researchers are working, which is higher education. And we spoke early on about this mission of FAIRsFAIR about fostering data culture and the uptake of good practice. But to do that, we need to have the attention. Many people need to change. One of the areas that we need to see changes in higher education organizations and institutions. To what extent do you think the ear is open there, that people are listening, and that the type of guidance and whatever that we're supplying is going to have an effect there?
Well, first of all, I would just like to congratulate you on completing this project, which I think has been very successful in raising the awareness of this important point in many higher education institutions around Europe and also in the rest of the world. And I've been following this work both as a member of the expert group of open science in the EUA, but also in various positions in Norway and at my university, at the University of Oslo. And what I see now is that there is a tendency at the top level, you could say, both internationally, nationally, and at institutions, that FAIR is important, and that we are seeing a change, the implementation of policies, for example, etc. So that side of things is progressing nicely, and not to say that we have solved everything, but at least we're on the right way. When it comes to the uptake among researchers, as we heard in the previous debate, the mileage varies a lot when it comes to some researchers and groups are very active and pushing for this. Others haven't even started and don't even know about the term and the concepts. So there's still a lot of work to do there. And as you say, also in terms of building community knowledge about this, that's particularly important.
Indeed. And in doing those things, in either making people aware or building the community knowledge, or even giving those who are already engaged the tools to help influence others and get change in their institutions. Do you think some of the work we've done perhaps on highlighting examples of good practice elsewhere, giving people patterns to follow, or indeed helping institutions develop policy can be of use here? Do you think those are the sorts of tools you might see that might spread this change further?
Absolutely. I think, first of all, policy making is extremely important, because if you do have policies in place and leadership acknowledges that this is important, then time and money flows as well into this direction. So that's certainly very, very important. I think also highlighting good examples of how this can be done is important, because I think, at least when I talk with people also at my own research center, is that I hear very few people that are opposed to the idea of making things fair. So it's more a matter of how should I do this? Why should I spend time on this now, etc. So then it's very important to have good examples of how it can be done. We need to have infrastructure in place to figure out where to put these things, how to do it, etc. But then also researchers also are often triggered by what kind of the incentives and rewards also when it comes to this. So that's why I think it's very important also to change the research assessment and researcher assessment along the way, to really be able to to also show people that not only publications count in the system or the citation points or H indexes or whatnot, but also that, for example, making a nice FAIRsFAIR data set is actually very important, and that you should also get credit for doing that type of work.
Absolutely. I know when we spoke about this before, I mean, that issue of incentives came up, and I think it's been an area of debate for many years. And for me, one of the things I often find frustrating is that we hear complaints that the incentive system is broken, the way we promote people, the way we value work is broken from researchers, and yet those committees that make those decisions are in general composed of researchers. And it seems strange that we complain about the system as if it's being imposed on us from outside, but we are the system. And yet, I think one of the remarks you made was that part of the problem is that not everybody is on the same, is advanced in the same way. And that all these committees that decide these things are made up of people from different organizations. Do you think there's an extent sometimes that we are held back by those who are least advanced, or is it that we can be led by those who are furthest forward?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about, if you look at universities around Europe, the interesting thing is that many universities are very linear in the way that they have kind of a vertical structure inside of the university, where you have kind of top level policies, and then you have kind of faculty things and department things and center things, etc. And then things follow that line. And when you have kind of, for example, regulations when it comes to an appointment committee for a professorship, you typically get some guidelines through that line, and they may also come from some national guidelines, etc. But there's still very much of kind of a linear structure. So that's kind of what is imposed from kind of a guideline perspective. On the other hand, if you look at what's actually going on in a committee is typically composed of people from outside of that institution. It may also be from outside of that country, because in many places you need to have external people from other countries and institutions. And so that's kind of when you have this horizontal type of kind of peer review, where people come in and bring with them their own kind of ideas about how things should be done, possibly also kind of knowledge about the guidelines in their institutions. The positive side of this is that you have kind of exchange going on, and you kind of get this global or international perspective on everything, kind of help move forwards there. The unfortunate or negative thing, perhaps, is that the system itself, or this way of working, becomes conservative when it comes to an uptake of these type of initiatives. On the other hand, again, by more progressive people also being on committees in perhaps less progressive institutions, that can also in itself kind of help moving things along. So it's not really that it's only positive or negative, but it's a very complex issue when it comes to how to handle this and really try to focus on the importance of verification.
Yeah, and indeed, I was going to ask you whether this is one of these top-down issues where the change is going to be driven by people at the top, or whether the pressure is going to come from researchers upwards to change their institutions. From what you said, it's a mixture of both those processes, and sometimes, as you say, horizontal between the institutions.
Exactly. No, I think we need to work on this from all levels and all perspectives, really. And also now, the positive thing now is that we have started to see a shift, and I think we have reached some kind of momentum now that it's really possible to move along. But there's still a lot of work to do, and it's important to continuously work towards making it clear to people how this can be done, and work with policies, tools, and etc.
Indeed, and that's one area I'm just seeing from the comments in the chat. We've had some engagement, but the Commissioner was going to suggest this may be one area, given that there are differences amongst nation states and how we're dealing with this, in particular in driving policy forward. And this is an area where transnational bodies, the Commission itself perhaps, can help in that coordination of policy, but perhaps all of us as individuals as well. I mean, many people I'm sure in this meeting today are occasionally on those types of committees you talked about. And if we are all then enabled to be a bit braver, perhaps, in bringing our principles to those meetings, backed up by some of the work that's been done, we can all be part of that change.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I know one of the other areas we wanted to talk about is that, we talk of higher education institutions as if they're a monolithic whole, but as you say, actually they're made up of almost mini institutions inside, whether it's departments, faculties, and that division in higher education is often done by domain of research, and there are differences there. And I'm intrigued in your perspective. Many people will not be aware. I mean, you're doing research in musicology, but coming to it from a background also in computer science as well, which is straddling what, to my mind, I'm not very well informed in this, perhaps other disciplines with quite different perspectives on what FAIR means and what sharing research means.
Absolutely. In my research center, we are working between musicology, psychology, and informatics. So we are kind of having three very different kind of disciplinary traditions meeting. And so it's a melting pot there. And that has also made me reflect a lot on the different traditions that you find in the arts and humanities versus the social sciences versus the technologies, the technological sciences. So in many ways, there are differences there in the approaches taken, but also by the interests of the researchers. And also the what you could call data, because, for example, when you talk to people in computer science or in psychology, everybody agrees what data is. But if you talk to people in a humanities faculty, there may be people that don't really understand what data actually is, and that they are working with data at all. So already at that point, we need to start kind of discussing what data is and how we could possibly start thinking about verification. And then there are always these kind of practicalities when it comes to how to make things fair. For example, think about music research and some of the things we're dealing with there when we're working with empirical material is that you easily get into all sorts of privacy issues because we deal with research on humans. We also often end up with copyright problems because we're dealing with music, which is copyrighted in different ways. So handling this also from a verification perspective is really challenging. How do you handle these things? What can you make open? What can you keep, or do you need to keep closed? But also, how do you structure information about privacy and copyright in such a way that you can keep the data closed, but still somehow make it as accessible as possible when it comes to, for example, metadata and other types of or layers of data that you possibly could make available in different ways?
Indeed, and I think that brings again that point that comes up again and again, and we try to work in that there's often this confusion between fair and open, and you're aware, and I know many of the audience here will be aware that these aren't identical concepts, and yet you mentioned two examples there to do with whether it's sensitive data or issues, whether it's copyright or other types of intellectual property involved. They can often make people feel, well, this doesn't apply to me because of these issues. And one of the areas perhaps we need to work harder on policy is saying, well, it does, it just applies in different ways.
Yeah, I think we should be careful also with, of course, you need to keep things closed that should be closed, but sometimes it may be very easy for someone to say that, well, my data needs to be closed, and then I don't really want to spend the time on making it fair either. So I think we need to change that mentality, and so that everybody agrees that the verification is actually important, even though the data is closed. But then again, we're back to the incentives and rewards. Why should you do this? What do you get out of spending that time? Because honestly, I mean, it takes time to verify anything. But on the other hand, why should things be so quick and fast all the time in a way? I mean, sometimes research should be slow, and it would benefit from being a little bit slower.
Yeah, and to pick up on that point about incentives and rewards, I mean, we've spoken about this a little in terms of the incentives for the individual, but perhaps also what we need to do to drive policy change, and perhaps a focus really further work is thinking about those incentives at the level of the institution, the organization. We've done a little work with Smart Europe in the past on trying to think, why should a university care about this? Well, is there a citation advantage, for instance, making data open? But I'd say at this point, I think we're drawing towards the end of our time. We want to allow for a couple of questions. So if you have a final quick point, and then we'll open up for questions. Unless we've come to the end of our discussion now. Thanks very much, Alexander. So questions briefly.
There are a couple in the chat already, which I think are nice to pick up. One is a note from Kostas Repanas from the European Commission. Yeah. I think it's nice one to mention. Kostas, if you want to open your microphone, it's a call for expression of interest for a process towards reform in the research assessment So it's a nice initiative we should all look at, and the drafting process will be led by UA and Science Europe. So
yeah,
it's an interesting initiative. And then we have,
and I think that's a great example there of the point Alexandra and I talked about, that where bodies like the Commission can help coordinate that policy shift at European level and help universities perhaps that are a bit more nervous about making that change.
If I could just comment there, I definitely think the funders are extremely important when it comes to pushing, because there are fewer funders than institutions, so that's easier to kind of make a change there. But I think this is particularly important for early career researchers that are more kind of vulnerable when it comes to, for example, mobility, moving around, and how whatever they do is kind of rewarded in the different systems. If you're looking for jobs in multiple countries and multiple institutions, it's very important that researchers know what they are assessed for and from.
Great. And Constance, can you activate your microphone now?
I think I've just done it for him.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. Thank
Yes.
you, Sarah and Kevin and everyone. Not much to say, actually. Just wanted to highlight maybe to some of the participants of this meeting that this effort is ongoing, and we really count on the participation of really the more the merrier in this case. And I agree totally with Alexander that it comes both from bottom up and top down. So we need everyone aligned in this effort to be able to really affect some change that is meaningful. Thanks.
Great. And then thanks also, Richard, for pointing to a couple of workshops they've organized in the framework of the FAIR Data Austria program. So we invite everybody to also look at them and get in touch with Richard if needed. And then there is a comment by Sarah Davinson, again, which relates on the theme of resources and funding in general to support this activity, which we're all sure, I mean, is of interest that can be discussed by many of us today in this meeting.